more sessions to go. Has everyone had a good day so far? Virtual nods of names. Amazing. Well, just a reminder, there are other rooms, so if you want to come in and out, but we will jump straight into it. Put your chats in the comments. Put your questions in the chat, and our speakers will keep an eye on them. But other than that, enjoy, and I'll pass the mic over to Maria and John.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Kia ora, talofa lava. Lovely to see everyone. And thanks for hanging in here in the post-lunch and afternoon break shift. I can tell that these are the people who are most committed to impact because you guys are still in the conference. So I'm excited for the kōrero we're going to have right now. So maybe we'll just start with some brief introductions and then talk a bit about how we'd love to use this time. So I'm Maria. I'm the CEO of ImpactLab. So we are a pretty new organisation. We've been around for 4 years, and we really aim to help decision makers in the social sector access data that can help them to do good better in their work with communities. And we also have John Perez here, who's from a partner organisation to ImpactLab called Fundamentally. So I'll just hand over to you, John, to say a hello.
Yeah, hi everybody. Nice to meet you all. So I'm a Senior Project Manager over at Fundamentally, and the motto at Fundamentally is that we back leaders who improve the lives of others. So we exist to serve the impact sector and help you mature digital operations, digital practices, generally to empower you to have an impact to the world around you.
Thanks, John. So we really wanted to cover 3 questions in the session today. The first one is, what is impact? Secondly, how can we measure it? And thirdly, and I think most importantly, how can we use what we measure to improve our decision making to get better outcomes for communities? So we're going to kind of explore each of those questions in the session. I think what we'll do is we'll spend about half the time just sharing some ideas, basically, and then the second half of the session, hopefully allowing time for some really good discussion on all of these because they're very meaty topics, and we've got amazing expertise in this room. I can see already, some people who are doing amazing work in communities and involved in all sorts of ways. So we'd really love to benefit from your expertise as well in the conversation. And I would also just say, please, and I thank you, Catherine, make extensive use of the chat function as we go through. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and John will as well. And we'll try and sort of touch on questions as we go, kind of where they're really relevant to what we're in that moment. But we'll also, in the Q&A time, be able to go back and have a good look at what's on people's minds. So please chat to your heart's content. So I'll kick us off, and I'll hand to John when we get to the third question. But firstly, what is impact? So I was actually driving recently in Mangere, and I saw a quote on a building. And it said, live your life as an exclamation, not an explanation. And that really kind of got me. And it got me thinking particularly about a guy that I met in the early days of ImpactLab. I was sitting at a kind of charity lunch next to a guy called Rob. And Rob had spent over half of his life in prison. And while he was in prison, he did 78 programs that were aiming to kind of rehabilitate him in some way. And none of it worked. And then when he was on the outside, at some point got connected with a charity called Te Whakaora Tangata in Clendon. And they worked with him over a number of years to really unpack and understand what were the root causes of where he was at in his life, including intergenerationally, and then helping him to really rebuild a sense of connection, confidence, resilience, and identity to move forward. And as Rob explained to me, he since then has not had a single offence, not even a parking ticket. He has his own lawnmower business. He was able to rebuild his relationship with his partner. And he also introduced me to his mum, who was sitting next to him, who he'd been reunited with as a result of going through this transformational change. So what is impact? From our point of view, that's impact. It's people living the lives that they choose, or what some might describe as tino rangatiratanga. And I think the key point here is it would have been really easy for Rob to live his life as an explanation of the factors, the traumas, the barriers that had got him to where he was. But he had the courage to imagine something different. And then there were people in his community who had the commitment to walk alongside him to make the changes to go after his aspirations. So the impact challenge, if you like, is how do we invest in ways that can support that kind of empowerment and autonomy, particularly for the New Zealanders who face the most barriers to living the lives that they choose. And when we look at the data, and I won't show it today because we're trying to be very picky on our slides as per Stephen's advice, but when you look at the data, you get this kind of curve where about 15% of New Zealanders use about half of government services. And those Kiwis have complex lives, a lot going on, multifaceted challenges, as well as, opportunities. And often what people need is really quite individualized relational support that's tailored to their unique journey. And of course, the challenge is that a lot of our mainstream services can't adapt to meet those unique needs. So this is, the guys with schizophrenia who are living in the forensic department of hospitals for a year because they don't have any adequate housing that they can be discharged to. This is families who are getting visited by the police 50, 60, we've seen cases of 84 times in a year, but are not accessing or able to access any mental health support to address the root cause of that violence. This is kids with severe dyslexia who are sitting in class all day, unable to read anything that the teacher's putting on the board, and that teacher not having the resource or really the time or capacity to respond to the individual needs of that tamariki. So this is the investment challenge. How do we make our investment work in these circumstances for people who are facing a whole lot of complexity in their lives? And so I guess why ImpactLab and Fundamentally was started is to help with one piece of this puzzle, which is data. How do we get an information flow going about where investment's going and who it's reaching? That's investment of money, but also time and strategic focus. What is that money actually translating into in terms of support and experiences of support that people are getting on the ground? And then thirdly, what can we sort of see that would build our confidence that that support is going to make a big difference to those people's lives in the long term? So those are the questions really that we're trying to answer through measurement and data and getting the systems in place, which John will talk about to enable that. So those are kind of, I guess, three nice questions. Of course, the challenge is, how do you actually measure this stuff? And at this point, I might just see if Isaac can give me the screen sharing power, which I think he has done. Great. So I guess the interesting thing here is in New Zealand, we spend about $85 billion a year on trying to improve social, health, educational outcomes for Kiwis. And of that 85 billion, that's across government and philanthropy, by the way, of that 85 billion, for almost none of it can we answer those three questions. Where's the money going? Who's it reaching and what support are people getting? And what difference is it making? So why is that? I think part of the reason why is because social change is really complicated. Like what it requires to make change in a life is a really complicated thing. And there's a whole lot of context that goes around that. So someone shared this picture with me recently, which I'll just pull up now. Where are we? Here we go. Can you guys see that picture? Oh, thanks so much, John. Yeah, this is the picture of obesity. It's complicated. So at the other end of the spectrum is what we might call the sort of well-intentioned optimists. And that's where we look at this and we say, well, yep, it's complicated and we can't measure that well. So what we're going to do is we're going to put money in and we're going to hope because, we've got good intentions. So we hope that if we spend the money, it's going to have the result that we want. Of course, the problem with that is we don't know whether what we're doing is having the result that we want. And as one philanthropist described it to me, it's like driving by looking through the rear view mirror, because we might be looking at the start, what's a good idea to fund, but we never go back to check whether that funding had the outcome that we wanted. And maybe we even get an evaluation done, but we don't read that evaluation and use it to inform the next set of decisions. So the kind of middle ground that we're learning about at ImpactLab and Fundamentally is that there's another way of approaching this. There's another way of kind of seeing this picture that gives us what we think is a kind of a better option than either of those two. And that is basically to use data to build confidence behind our decision making in a context of uncertainty. And I think that's really important. Is there's, you know, from what we've seen at least, there's not this kind of magic way of measuring things that reduces or removes all the uncertainty. But what we can do is we can build relatively more confidence than what we have from the perspective of not having any information at all. But in order to do that, we've actually got to look at the system a bit differently to this. So if we jump to the next page, John. This is kind of a different picture, and this has been developed through ImpactLab's work with over 250 programs run by charities and for-purpose organisations, reaching 300,000 New Zealanders. But it's, in a sense, it's pretty simple, but you can imagine its application is pretty complex. So what the picture is showing is the dotted line of the trajectory of someone's life. So we can imagine that over time, people have ups and downs in their life. And by the way, you could look at this from an individual perspective. You could also look at this from a collective perspective in terms of a whānau or a wider community group. But the point is that there's going to be ups and downs, and there's a story and there's a past of where people have come from. And then at some point, they're going to interact with a program or initiative or a service. And the opportunity at that point is to shift the positive forward pathway of that person or that whānau's life. And that can be both about avoiding the kind of the downward trajectory you can see there, which might be the negative outcomes that might be expected if nothing changed. Like in Rob's situation, that might mean reoffending or ending up back in prison. But also, and more importantly, it's the positives that can be achieved with the help of that support. So that might be something like reconnecting with whānau, or improving your mental health, or getting a job. And so we think about something called social value, which is the difference between what would be likely to happen without support in the general case, and then how that can shift in a more positive direction with support. So social value, we actually value it as a dollar figure. So we quantify the impact, and I'll talk a bit more in a bit about how we do that. But the reason for that is because it enables us to link the long-term impact of something we're funding or doing to the investment that goes in, the dollar investment that goes into that program or service. So it enables us to shift the conversation from being about cost to being about value. So for example, providing housing to people who have really complex mental health conditions and might be living on the street. That is a really high investment, complex thing to do. And even more so, it costs even more if we put the wraparound services around that housing that can enable people to get support for addiction, for mental health, or for other things that they need. But if we can't understand the long-term impact and value of adding those additional supports, all we can really see is that it costs more. And so it's really hard to actually make the confident case to be able to make the long-term investments that really we can see people need. So that's one thing about social value, is that it's quantified, and there are limitations to that, and we can talk a lot about those as we go through. But it enables that link to investment. The second thing is that we're taking, wherever we can, really a lifetime view, trying to step back and put the person as the protagonist in their own story, and understand not just what happens immediately as a result of support, but actually what happens in the long term. And in some areas, like the first 1,000 days, for example, we might be having to project 20, 30, 40 years into the future to really understand what the impact is of the support that's being provided. But we think that's really important, because often it takes much longer than, a month or a year to really support fundamental change and supporting people to achieve their aspirations. So that long-term view is really important. The final thing that we're learning is really important is taking quite a holistic approach. So what we're learning is that, things in people's lives, people don't live their lives according to how government departments are organized. So if someone has good quality housing, that impacts their health, that impacts their children's school attendance. If someone is able to get a sense of, a sense of purpose through community connection, that might impact their ability to seek employment. So we've got to really look holistically at how these different domains interact and try and measure across them, rather than just taking a one-dimensional view. So that's kind of, I guess, conceptually social value. That's it for the slides on this bit, so we can stop sharing the screen. Thanks, John. So then the next question is, how do we actually measure social value? And I think that, we've got to think about it in terms of reducing uncertainty. But what we're finding is that there's a set of core questions that we can ask. And asking this question, kind of each question individually, is really useful in terms of understanding impact. But when you put them together, you can also get this kind of view of social value and ultimately a view of what we call social return on investment, which is a measure of, for every dollar that you invest in X program, this is an estimate of the value returned to Aotearoa through improvements in people's lives. So there's a few key questions here, and I think what I'll do is I'll step through them not in much detail, just kind of briefly, and then we can always come back in the Q&A to more detail. But the questions are basically, firstly, who is it that we're trying to reach and make a difference for, and what's the opportunity to make a difference in those people's lives? So understanding the who is really critical. We worked with a charity recently who, when they looked at the data about who were the tamariki they were working with, and this was a program for kids with behavioural challenges, they realised that a big portion of the kids had neurodevelopmental challenges, but their staff were receiving no training at all on how to adapt what they were doing to support those kids. So just looking at that data about the who gave them an understanding of the opportunity to improve how they actually worked with those kids. So that's the first thing. And we can look at both data that a frontline service is collecting. We can also estimate from government data what we think the opportunity might be. For example, if you're dealing with employment, if you're a Pacific person in Wellington versus a Pacific person in Auckland, the likelihood of facing unemployment is actually quite different. Second question is, we know who we're working with. What changes do we think that we could see in people's lives, or we want to see in people's lives as a result of the thing that we're investing in? So this is really about mapping out what are the outcomes or the positive life changes that we want to see for people. And then at ImpactLab and Fundamentally, we assign a dollar value to that by looking at avoided government costs, income impacts, and sort of intrinsic or subjective well-being benefits to individuals. So for example, we worked with a disability employment program, and their core outcome was trying to help people, long-term beneficiaries with disabilities, into good, sustainable employment. So employment is their key outcome. There were many others as well, but for employment, we were able to look at the income impact, because if you've got a disability in New Zealand and you're unemployed, it's 4 times harder to get a job. It's kind of an oversimplification of the stats, but basically you're 4 times less likely to get a job in a given year than someone who's unemployed without a disability. So we were able to see, well, here's the income impact of that for the individual, but also here's the healthcare impact, because we find in the data that when people have a job, they're actually less likely to use acute healthcare services. So that's impact, understanding the outcomes, and then where we can, valuing those. The third question is, if this is who we're working with, this is the impact we want to have, how effective is what we do at actually achieving that? So that's really about understanding the actual service itself. Quite specifically, if someone is journeying through a service or experiencing your product, what does that look like step by step? What's the support that they get? And what is the magic source of what makes that work really well? So it's about understanding your own, or the intervention you're looking at deeply, and then trying to kind of build confidence around the long-term impact of that approach. So the way that we typically do that at ImpactLab and Fundamentally is we look at the evidence base, because it's quite rare for organizations to have their own longitudinal data about effectiveness. If they have it, that's great, but if they don't, we'll look at the evidence to look for similar programs for similar populations. Is there evidence, and how strong is that evidence that, for example, a 24-month mentoring program and employment placement can lead to sustained employment for people with disabilities? The fourth question is, how many people? So this is really a question of scale and reach. So we look at how many people are you reaching, but critically, how many of those people are meaningfully engaging with what you're providing? So we've looked at, for example, a financial kind of helpline, where when they tracked the data, they realized that over 60% of the people that called them never actually got to a level of like a long enough, useful enough engagement on the phone call to get help. And most worryingly, they found that the kind of 10%, 5 to 10% of people who were in the most severe distress were the most likely to drop out before getting helped. So understanding both your reach, but also the engagement that you're getting can be really useful as a bit of a proxy of whether or not the service is working for people. But it also helps us to quantify, in a sense, the reach of the impact of a program or intervention. So those are kind of the four key questions about impact: who, what changes, how effective is it, and how many people at what level of engagement. The final thing is cost. And that's the easiest, because that's the only part of this where there's generally good, solid data. But even then, and I noticed our friend Craig Fisher, who's an expert on this, is in the room, it can be still quite complicated to allocate cost. But really what we want to understand is, on a per person basis or a per whānau basis, what's the investment that's going in? So we can then compare the cost to a multiplication of all the other questions on the social value side to get to this social return on investment. So I've just kind of rattled through that pretty quick. I hope that sort of is a little bit of a framework of how we think about actually measuring impact. And we kind of need to triangulate between frontline data, government data, and academic evidence to get to those answers. But we can often get to a pretty good answer on at least some of those questions to understand and estimate impact. So the third question is, if that's kind of a way, and it's not the only way, but it's a way of measuring impact, how can we actually use what we measure to learn and improve? And particularly, how do we do that on an ongoing basis? Because what we're kind of learning is it's good to get like a point in time view of here's an estimate of the impact of a program. But where it really becomes useful is being able to build a trend line over time to see what's changing and why, and how do we respond to that. And that requires systems, because it means that you need systems within your organization to be able to collect and use that data on an ongoing basis. So I'm going to hand to John from Fundamentally to talk a bit about what we're learning about how to approach that, because it seems to be one of the main barriers that organizations face to measuring impact, is just getting sort of right-sized systems in place to tell you what it is that you want to know.
Thank you, Maria. Yeah, so I'm going to start with a story as well. So you can probably tell from my accent, I'm a Londoner, and I did work in London with a charity that worked frontline with homeless people. We had a network of volunteers that could house somebody for 2 or 3 days while we could get them into the government system to provide them with housing. If you've been to London, you'll see that homelessness there is a huge problem. And what we tried to do is connect people who were on the street with people who had spare rooms. And this was 20 years ago, and we were very immature in our operating practices, in our data. And I think it's often a pattern certainly in the impact sector, is that you see a need and you go to meet that need, and that takes the top priority. So, as Maria was saying, it takes a degree of sophistication to move to an understanding of how what you're doing is having an impact. And we talked about, changing from a framework of cost to value, taking a holistic approach and taking a long-term impact. So I really want to give you something practical out of this talk. So I'm going to share some practicals that we use at Fundamentally. And usually we would get involved as a partner to ImpactLab, where ImpactLab have taken the organization through the journey to determine the social return on investment. And sometimes there will be gaps in the data. It's difficult to identify the who, or it's difficult to identify the opportunity or the changes in outcomes. So often we're pulled in to help the organization to lift its data maturity and do more with what they already have, so that they can actually measure and understand the impact that they're having. So I'm going to share my screen and just talk you through a diagram. Can you enable sharing for me, please? I can't see the little button. No, it's not there. Okay, well, I'll talk you through it. So basically, at the basic layer, if you think of it as a pyramid, where at the very top you've got your decision making, and you're getting real-time data, And that data enables you to understand the impact that you're having and what levers you can move to maximize the impact that you're having. Beneath that, obviously, you've got to collect that data and present it in a manner that is understandable. So if you think of the diagram that we shared earlier about well-being and time, if you could see the well-being and time of an individual and project it, that would be a phenomenal report to use. So underneath, before you can get to the reports, you've obviously got to enable your data. So this may come to the quality, how the data gets into your systems, the consistency with which that data exists in your systems. And then underneath that layer is a digital operations. So, and digital operations, I'll give you an example. A client we worked with recently was looking to scale from effectively what was a one-person startup to a team, and their funder engaged us to help them effectively put together what we call a business in a box. So out of a box, provide them with the payroll systems that they would need, the customer relationship management systems that they would need, the website systems. So it's almost instantly enabling all the digital operations under which they can operate more effectively. Another example might be the data enablement piece, where a well-established impact organization was able to influence government policy recently through the reports, where we took the data that they already had, and we were able to provide them with the reports that they could use to influence government policy on the Consumer Credit and Finance Act, by demonstrating that there were legislation points backed by data that needed to be in the act to protect vulnerable people. And then ultimately, really, it's about providing that information to ensure that you are empowered as leaders, and you've got the information that you need. In the corporate world, the word that's used is a balanced scorecard. Effectively having an impact balanced scorecard as part of your day-to-day operations. So what we're finding is that there's barriers to do this, and I've grouped them into two. I call them perceived barriers. So it's often a perception that we don't have the data, or we need to set up a lot of new systems in order to get that data. Or it's the perceived complexity of dealing with the systems that you've already got. And I say those are perceived because often when we go in and we work with a client, we'll find that they actually have the data. It's often a case that there's difficulty in extracting the data from the systems, or they haven't got repeatable processes by which they can go back and leverage that data as well. So often it's simple fixes, and it's using automation that's already available to provide that information, those reports on an ongoing basis. The other, in some cases, actual barriers may be that there's a perception that the cost of digital engagement or engaging digital experts is quite high. So what we've tried to do is design.
To interrupt, John, you now are a co-host, so if you needed to share, or if you've moved past that, you now have the capability.
Oh, do I now? Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I still can't see the button, so I don't know. I was able to see it when Maria was talking, so maybe Maria can see it now. But
okay.
That's okay. That's we can share the slides afterwards as well. So what I'm going to try and give you what I've found is probably the most powerful tool to mapping your data in my 20 years of working in the industry, and that's something called a service blueprint. And what that enables you to do is you can go and look at the journey of how you service your customers, and then look at what systems are you using to support each stage of that journey. And there's plenty of guidance online on how to do this. If it's done, it's no more than an hour's exercise as an investment to just open your eyes to what data you have and how you can use that data in in servicing customers, and it's a very very powerful tool. So that's all I really wanted to say. It is important to just make a start. That's you can actually do a lot more with what you already have in place, and that's really the key message that we want to give you is make a start with the data that you have.
Yeah, and I can see a question. I think we'll flick now to Q&A. There's a question about the data, which is from Damien, which is around, are the models proprietary or bespoke for doing this kind of measurement? And to John's point, a lot of the data we use in these processes is the data from community organizations and companies themselves. So a lot of the answers to those core impact questions actually come from your own data. And certainly we find it's sort of a mix of, you often have much more than you think you do. But on the other hand, there's also a lot you don't know, and that becomes frustrating, but it's also where a lot of the value of going through a process like this is, because you discover those gaps. I'm just thinking of one we had recently. It was an adult education centre, and their data showed about 5% of their adult learners had community service cards, which is how they measured whether people were in sort of significant financial need. And they thought that number is way too low. So they looked into it and they found that they were requiring people to go physically into their office and present their card in person to be counted. And people felt quite a bit of shame about that. Also, it was pretty inconvenient to have to do that. So they've now changed to an online sort of digital way of tracking that. And of course, the numbers shot right up and they have a much better view of need. So I think a lot of the data is from the organizations. Having said that, at ImpactLab, we've kind of built out some proprietary data sets, and we also link in with the integrated data infrastructure, the IDI, which is a government linked data environment managed by Stats New Zealand. And that's sort of theoretically accessible to the community, but we've found in practice really difficult, if not impossible, for particularly medium and small organizations to access. So we kind of do that, get the data and then share that back with communities. And that's really powerful because it shows how people journey through government services at a population level over their lifetimes. We've got another question from Judy, which is, how do you isolate the impact of the investment from all of the other interventions that might be happening? Great question. And it comes back to that obesity diagram. It is really difficult to do that. So what we do is we've found there are some kind of simple things that seem simple but often aren't done that can help you kind of isolate impact. The first thing is who could actually benefit from a certain outcome. So for example, if you've got a health promotion intervention to do with smoking, do you know how many of the people you reach are smokers already or not? Because if they're already a smoker, then you've got a lot more opportunity to make a difference than if they're not. Or similarly for unemployment, how many of the people who you're doing your employment intervention with have recently been employed or not? For school achievement, you can look at what has been the historical achievement in different schools to get a sense of what might be the typical case. So I think understanding the who helps you at least figure out a bit who's in the ballpark to be benefiting from an intervention. Then the second part is the how effective is this thing? And I think that's mainly what your question's about. So to look at that, we basically mine the academic evidence base for the best evidence that has unpicked the kind of the causation of different interventions. And that could be something like a randomized control trial. Often it's not because it's really difficult to do RCTs on the types of things we're looking at. But what's the best quality evidence that can say that this specific intervention can contribute to a positive outcome? And then we discount it heavily because we have to be really conservative about the assumptions that we're making. So what you kind of end up with is a very conservative but evidence-informed view of probabilities of interventions having an impact. And of course, that's not the same as a cast iron sort of really clear isolation of impact, but it's certainly good enough, we're finding, to be able to move the dial and move things forward. We've got another question from Alexander. How do you quantify social benefits, i.e. engagement of community? I wonder, Alexander, if you are on the call, would love
yes,
to
I'm
just...
on.
Yeah, perfect. Would love to hear social benefits, what you kind of think about when you think of that.
I'm kind of more meaning, let's say, the classical, ESG debate, when you can measure everything, and then when you're looking at, let's say, for instance, you can measure the environmental fairly easy, but now, with the social, we're still, debating, there's still global debates, what's actually best practices. So I was wondering, how do you guys try and quantify it? And I was even giving a simple example of, how would you try and quantify stakeholder engagement? When, let's say, you're doing a corporate project and you're working, getting a community involved, how would you quantify, assign a cost to, what would it mean if you haven't involved the community? Because it's hard to say, then we wouldn't have done this and what this would have been. So it's very extrapolatory.
Yeah, it's a great question. And yeah, I guess we focus particularly on social impact, not so much environmental, because we've found social is complicated enough, but we're increasingly partnering with environmental groups and measurement groups because we're finding there's this big intersection as well between the two.
Yeah,
that's probably a session for another day. But in terms of your question about quantifying, say for a corporate, getting community engagement, I guess it's kind of how do you get from the output to the outcome? Because the output is, that's probably a decent place to start, right? Like, how many people in what communities are you engaging in what way? And from my experience, a lot of corporates don't actually have a good answer to that question. So I think that's the first thing, is just from an output perspective, what does that engagement actually look like? Then the question is, what changes in people's lives because of that engagement? And I think that can be a really challenging one. But that's kind of where you need to get to really get to what we describe as impact. We need to be able to draw a line and say, because the community is engaging with this initiative, this is going to result in these changes. And those can be fairly abstract. For example, it might be like, the community is engaging with a cultural initiative that gives people a more stable sense of their own identity. And we might measure that in terms of improvements in mental health. It might be more tangible. Like, we looked at a whole bunch of community engagement around the Cook Island community in Tamaki Makaurau for entrepreneurship. And that was really interesting to sort of see, well, how does this kind of community engagement lead to potentially inspiring or helping members of the community to engage in entrepreneurial activities? And what does that mean for their lives, in terms of what they can produce from that, and their health and their employment and all of that. So it's really just drawing that bridge is the hard part.
Yeah, I can imagine coming up with that theory of change, making that argument because of that, that happened, that outcome happened.
Yeah, and that's what we find looking at the stories and hearing from the people who were involved, who benefited from the support, is the best way to find that out, because they can say what changed in their lives or what didn't. And sometimes it's really interesting. We hear surprising things which weren't part of the theoretical story, but were a big part of the actual story. Like, I remember talking to a mother of a kid with autism who was going to this sort of community hub where parents get supported. And she said the number one benefit of this hub was that it meant she didn't have to drive to 12 different places across the week to take her kid to different appointments. And her son was a lot less stressed because going into all these foreign environments totally freaked him out. So, that's the real impact for that family. And I think that's where the participant voice is critical to drawing that link. Okay.
Thank you.
I think we've got another one here from, is it Safe? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right, but we've got a good question. Do you see greater demands on social value reporting, SROI, particularly from funders and government? What will it take to mainstream social values alongside environmental and governance measures? Well, it's a really good question. So yes, I would say we certainly are seeing increasing interest from government, particularly as a funder, around this kind of measurement. And I think the reason for that is a lot of community funders, they can actually go and see something happening and they can meet the people doing it. And that gives them sufficient confidence to invest. But as soon as you start getting steps away from the actual community where things are really happening, it becomes harder and harder to really understand what's going on. And so there's a really natural application of this kind of measurement in a government context where, agencies might be allocating millions or hundreds of millions of dollars and they need to get some kind of view of what's happening, but they can't actually get that real frontline perspective. So I think we're seeing that increasingly, I think also from funders as well. And what we're hearing, particularly from philanthropic funders, is for them, it's much less about the number per se. You know, you've got an SROI of 10 or 5 or 1. What's really of interest is what is the charity or organization doing with that information? So are you using that to further focus your activities? Are you learning something that can help, you know, build confidence to go in a certain strategic direction? Does this empower frontline staff to really be validated about the difference that they're making long term? That's what philanthropic funders that we work with are really particularly interested in, as well as just understanding their own portfolio, because one of the benefits of this kind of measurement is that it is specific. And in a sense, that's misleading, I suppose, because there's so much assumptions in these models. But the specificity can really help unpack the distinctions between things. So, for example, we worked recently with a couple of mentoring organizations that the funders kind of saw as being basically the same because they all do youth mentoring. But what we found was actually one of them works with kids who are engaging with police a lot on the edge of dropping out of school completely. Another mentoring program works with the highest potential kids who face financial barriers to tertiary education. Very different groups, very different impact stories. And so this kind of toolkit helps funders just to understand a little bit better the distinctions of what it is they're funding. And what will it take to mainstream it? Well, I'm curious your thoughts on that because yeah, that's a good question.
And we just have 2 more minutes. So if you want to bring us to the close.
Great. Well, maybe John, I've done a lot of talking. I might hand to you just to kind of maybe sum up some key takeaways from the session.
Sure. So one of the things I've noted here is it's really important to change that conversation to use impact measurement so that the conversation changes from cost to value. The second thing was taking a holistic approach and understanding the long-term impact. And back to that story on homelessness that I shared is that that particular charity, it's called Hope UK, became very powerful at intervening within the first 3 days of someone being homeless on the streets. Because what the data showed is that if they could intervene within 3 days, the likelihood of long-term homelessness, but for that person, dropped quite significantly. I can't give the exact percentage figure, but it was very, very impactful for them just to be able to provide accommodation to someone within 3 days of that person becoming homeless. So it's those kind of insights that are incredibly powerful from data, because then they, in their case, they focused all their attention on how can we help someone, how can we identify somebody, and how can we help them within the first 3 days. So the other questions that were raised was, who are you reaching? What is the opportunity? And what are the changes and the outcomes? And on the conversation, I've posted a link to a service blueprint framework. I would encourage you, if you do one thing off the back of this, go spend an hour, invest an hour just mapping out your service, how you work with those people that you're providing services to, and you'll see that you'll find, just out of doing that exercise, that you've got far more data available to you to understand the impact that you're having than you know about. So in other words, just make a start.
Thanks so much, John. And I've also posted an email address for noah@impactlab.co.nz. If you'd like the presentation from today, just give Noah a bell and he can share that with you. Or if you have other kind of follow-up questions, Noah's your man.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maria and John, for that. That was great. Data can be very scary and daunting. So thank you for showing how it can be so useful to all of us. So thank you. And so we're going to get on to